Hi, my name is Matt Wilhelmy, and I'm the owner of Strategic Voyages Business Consultants. I'm also the author of Taboo Business Questions, What's Haunting Every Entrepreneur's Growth. And today I'm really excited because I am joined again by my good friend, Amy Wilson. She is a fractional CMO. You might hear a little bit of her accent. She's from the UK, but she has over 10 years of experience leading performance marketing initiatives on a global scale. She's also typically brought in by investors to work with first-time founders to solve some of those marketing issues. And we, in our last episode, did get into one particular case study where the business did not have any marketing reports of any sorts. And so we'll come back to that here in a minute. But the whole point of this episode, Amy, is to really understand kind of what happens when a business kind of doesn't take your advice. And I would imagine doing this for a while, that has to have happened at least once, where you're, talking to somebody and maybe they didn't really either like your advice, they didn't agree with it, they just didn't do it. And so the first one you told me about was a story that the different decision makers basically were not taking your advice quick enough. You kind of laid out some expectations and then maybe they didn't work right. And so I'm just curious, kind of how that went. And maybe you could start at the top with telling us a little bit about, this particular case study.
This particular scenario isn't actually one client. I've had about 3 different clients that have fallen into this exact same trap. Now, one of the things I specialize in as a fractional chief marketing officer with startups is coming in around the time that game-changing levels of investment come into a company. And often around seed or Series A, that's the first time a company has had enough budget to adequately address their brand. So whether that's their naming, their visual identity, their value proposition, all their brand assets like their websites and all their collateral. That's one thing that I get brought in to do quite a lot. Now, I've been involved in this variations of this project a number of different times, and the scenario that you're talking about, Matt, is when I advise the founders about the timeline that it takes to run a branding process or a naming and a branding process. And depending on which agency you work with and the size and the scale of the agency you work with and the size and the scale of the brief, I think the quickest I've ever delivered like a full naming and rebranding exercise is 8 weeks, and that is that's record breaking. The last time I ran a competitive process for this, we were looking at anything up to 32 weeks from start to finish. So when I was taking the founders through that process, I was saying to them, if you need this by a specific date, please bear in mind, like, this is the time process that's required, and not just giving them an arbitrary number, but showing them all the deliverables and the lots of agencies. I think most of the agencies in the process have provided us with these lovely Gantt charts. And I don't even need to say what happened next. I'm sure you can guess, but in every scenario, the founder's like, oh, I don't want to get started on this yet, but for whatever reason. Usually the money hasn't come in, but sometimes there's other reasons as well. And then you get to this point where 3-6 months later the money's come in, but the founder wants the end result. Can we get it next week, or can we get it the week after that? And yeah, that's not the best position to be in. Like, often agencies can speed up their timelines, and a way to get a really, really fast result is to work independently with freelancers, but obviously you're going to probably pay a little bit more to get that speed, and it's something you can avoid if you plan effectively.
And Amy, I would guess, and maybe you can clarify here, but I would guess that even if you were to be able to deliver something in this expedited timeline, or maybe another team, because you probably need more than just one person at that point, but you get all this work done in a truncated timeline, the quality just isn't going to be there, because you don't have the ability to kind of get more feedback. You just miss that collaborative time, right?
Yeah, and I would say it goes further than that, actually, because especially my experience of running competitive pitch processes, there's branding agencies that go into favor. They win lots of awards, or they get a lot of high profile prestigious work, and that allows them to be really discerning about the types of clients that they want to take on. And I haven't got time to get into it today, but one of the best ways to get a really rubbish result out of your award-winning creative agency is to not really let them do what they need to do. And so for a lot of agency founders, if a client comes to them saying, we want to take your 32-week plan and make it happen in 3 weeks, all the good ones are going to just go no, like they're just not going to work with you. So that's another thing, you know, as a CMO, I'd have to kind of manage those expectations with the founders. And you know, on a side note, like I will say this because I get asked all the time, like, how do I know if I'm hiring a good supplier? How do I know if I'm hiring a good marketing manager? And the answer for me is always, have they said no to you at any point when you've asked them something in the interview process? Because the good ones, the good guys, are the ones that will just say, no, what you're asking me is ridiculous. We're going to do this instead. And the most surefire way to hire a rubbish employee or a rubbish agency is if you just ask them to do lots and lots of ridiculous, timely, like cheap things, and they'll say, yes, of course we can do that. We'll do whatever you want. And then you hire them and you find out that they're just a bunch of nonsense. So that's my big piece of advice that slides into that timeline question.
Yeah, I can absolutely relate because I have worked with other consultants who have tried to be kind of too many things to too many people. And I don't want to be that person. And so I do try to stick to what I know, which is in the finance world. And I do understand things about marketing, and I understand things about, you know, the HR side of the business and the legal side of the business, but that doesn't make me an expert in those. And so I know enough to maybe have a conversation or two, but then I'll probably say something along the lines of like, hey, we need to get somebody who's like a specialist involved, right? Who does these types of things. And maybe in your world that happens too. So really quick, Amy, I did want to kind of highlight a section of my book. I mentioned that I'm an author. I wrote this book called Taboo Business Questions, What's Haunting Every Entrepreneur's Growth. And I wrote a chapter on marketing. Again, that does not make me a marketing expert, but the reason I was able to write this chapter is because I saw a lot of the problems that business owners were doing. And I'm going to be interested to hear your feedback here, but I basically wrote about 4 levels that business owners take when they're thinking about differentiation. And the reason I wrote about differentiation is because I think that's such a key in marketing and in the marketplace to kind of make yourself well known. You don't want to sound like everybody else. You don't want to do all the same things that everybody else does, because then you're kind of competing on the wrong maybe aspects. And so here are the 4 levels of marketing differentiation. The first one, level 1, is non-participatory differentiation. And basically that is stumbling around in the dark. You don't have any differentiation. You're not doing anything to differentiate yourself at all. And probably you don't even know that you should. Level 2 is differentiating on customer service. And this is actually a fallacy because in my mind, you're not going to win on customer service because customer service is expected. You should always be giving good customer service. And so that's not really something to differentiate on. The third level is imitation differentiation. And so this is where you're thinking that you're differentiating from something, but actually your competitor has whatever this thing is that you're differentiating in, but they're like way better at it. And so they have it in spades. Now, the fourth one, this is where I really wanted to get to. This is the positive type of differentiation. This is where you're purposeful and you're direct in your differentiation. And so you've got a brand story that actually creates real differentiation. It can be felt by your followers. There's a clear story. There's a purpose behind it. And I feel like that's where a lot of brands want to get to. And maybe they would hire somebody like Amy to help them get there. So I know you haven't heard these 4 levels before. I'm sure that you've got some feedback on those, but I just wanted to interject that for a minute because I think it's really important when we're talking about marketing to also think about that brand story and that differentiation that companies sometimes don't have.
Yeah, it's so important. I could spend hours just talking on this topic alone. And I think, I came up through the performance marketing route. I didn't start out as a CMO. Obviously, I didn't start out across things like brand and PR. And as I've got to that level of seniority in my career, I started looking after those functions. And I think I started to notice what blew my mind when I was still in performance marketing. And you would see companies spending, I don't know, like £500,000 a month on a PPC campaign, but they hadn't considered what messaging was even going to go into those adverts. Maybe what are they, like 70, I can't remember anymore, God, like 70 to 90 characters long. But if you're just letting a junior executive write those, or like 10 different junior executives across the company writing all those different ads, there's going to be no like consistency. The brand isn't going to shine through. And the best results we ever used to see with PPC were from the companies that had a really, really strong branding agency that came in and did all the groundwork beforehand. So I totally agree with that. I think the other thing is that I would say my experience with founders has taught me that, I always give the advice that no one can write their own value proposition. I can't write mine. You can't write yours. A founder, you're too close to it. It's like trying to describe your own arm or your partner of 20 years. You just can't do it, and you shouldn't do it, right? And so that's where the value proposition should be done by someone else. Even if it's just not you, if you're completely bootstrapping, you just do a skill swap with another founder, because they will have that objectivity that you don't have. But in an ideal world, you'll have someone who's trained and really, really good to write your value proposition. And I find that I get sent so many different pitch decks all the time. And I notice that a lot of founders say exactly the same thing across different sectors. And there's all this subjective messaging coming in, and statements like we're so unique, there's no competitors like us, and you see it over and over again. And I'm not even like a full-time investor. I don't work for a fund or anything, so I imagine these things are just even worse if you're working for a fund. So what I would say, it comes down to hiring someone to get that value proposition absolutely right before you spend a penny on packaging, on media or marketing. And what often surprises founders is that the most simple and effective, clear value propositions are the ones that take the greatest level of expertise. And it's a journey I absolutely love going through. Like when you go through a pitch process with the first-time founder, they get the first meeting with the branding agency, where the branding agency maybe gives their portfolio, and that founder might go, "Oh, that's really simple. Like I don't understand that. But why is that so well received?" And then they go through the process. They select an agency, and then they go through the process with the agency of like blowing up all the possible ideas and distilling it back down to a really, really simple message. And that is the part that the best people requires. The best, like anyone can regurgitate like a 30-page PowerPoint that doesn't get to the point. It's the skill and expertise comes from being able to distill your business into like one or two key sentences, because in today's world, that's really how long you get. You don't get a 5-minute YouTube video. You don't get a 5-page presentation. You get a couple of sentences to get someone to invest more of their time to then watch that video or read the presentation. So that's what I really have to work quite hard to drill into the heads of founders that I work with.
Yeah, I can think about a couple of different people that have asked me to help them with branding, and I've had to shut the conversation down. I don't want to do that, but they'll ask me like, "Hey Matt, what do you think about this different branding idea?" And it's like a lot of words, and it's just too hard to kind of understand, right? The best marketing is often the most simple, but it doesn't start out that way. But Amy, I want to hear about the second cautionary tale. So you had mentioned in our little break there that we have maybe a second one that has to do with a founder maybe focusing on the wrong things. And so, you probably do your best job to create an action plan or to create a timeline. I think you talked about a Gantt chart. So there shouldn't be really any confusion on what to do and when to do it and how to do it. But maybe these founders are just a little bit distracted. Maybe they have a lot going on and they end up focusing on some of the wrong things. And so I was hoping that maybe you could tell us the story about a founder that just didn't use your advice.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked me this question, because I think it's actually a really pertinent question to go over in International Women's Month. When I was younger in my career, people wouldn't take my advice, and I just thought it was because I was young. And now I'm a fairly expensive C-suite, and it absolutely blows my mind that founders pay me what they do, bring me into their business, bring me into meetings, and how often I give advice and it's not taken. And I've talked to a lot of other female C-suites about this, and I think it's worth acknowledging that there is an issue with authority bias, and I don't think we should get into it today. And I think if you don't know what it is, Google it. So I come up with authority bias a huge amount in my career. And I give you a really, really funny example. When I was really early on in my career, and I was about 2 years into my career, I was working at a network agency, and I noticed that the graduates were all spending an awful lot of time building reports. I noticed that 3 graduates were working full time on one account to build reports. So I worked out that on labor alone, it was costing the business over £90,000 a year to create reports. So I suggested to my boss, why don't we get this technology that does it all automatically, and it will save you time, and we don't have to grow the team. And they didn't go ahead and take my recommendation. But then my boss texted me, like, I'd left the company. He texted me 2 years later, and he said, by the way, just to let you know, they hired Accenture, whoever, and they paid them £300,000, and they told them to hire employ the technology you suggested. And I was just laughing. I thought it was so funny. So that's like a perfect example of maybe of authority bias. So when you're faced with that, when you're giving advice to a founder and they're not taking it, God, there's lots of different approaches you could take, I suppose. And obviously, like interpersonally, it's really horrible to be brought into a company and persistently be giving advice, like your expertise and your opinions don't matter. But one of the best strategies I've found for getting it over the line is to have allies in the C-suite. So usually some men in the C-suite who would gently repeat the same suggestions over and over again. And obviously, it's really, really disheartening if your strategy and your ideas are attributed to somebody else, and they get the credit for it. But sometimes it's just more important for the business that the recommendation goes ahead. And then the other thing, I know you asked me about if the founders are focusing on the wrong thing. Sometimes it is strategically possible to, the founder's asking you to do one thing, but you actually think the founder needs to be focusing on something else. You could sort of do the customer facing thing of doing whatever it is the founder wants you to do. But if budget and resource are available, you could sort of just do the thing that needs to be done on the sly. And what's the expression? Ask forgiveness, not permission. And especially if you're so convinced that the results are going to speak to themselves. But for me as a consultant, it's always treading that line of like, do I want the project to be a success? Do I want to keep my job? And it's really hard. Like sometimes you can push too much that they don't want you in the company anymore, but you're in a kind of lose-lose situation, because if you don't get the results they want, we're not going to have a job either. And there's nothing more frustrating than sitting in meetings for 6 months giving advice and that advice not being taken, and then the boss coming in and going, so what have you actually delivered for me in the last 6 months? But it sounds bonkers, but this is the situation that many consultants have found ourselves in. So for me, it's really just about trying to read the room and walk the line and seeing what you can get away with, and what's what battles are worth fighting and what aren't really.
Yeah, as a consultant myself, I've been doing this for almost 15 years now. That's happened a few times. Giving out advice, it doesn't land. I did also at some point in my career feel like maybe it was because of my youth. I'm still really young, which I totally get, but imagine trying to be 22 or 23 years old and advising these C-suite executives. They kind of look at you like a child. So I get it, but I have developed some different skills to kind of get around that. But you mentioned authority bias, and we don't have to get into it either, but I think that's unfortunately a relevant topic for maybe you and I can discuss another time. So anyway, I want to kind of wrap up this episode with a few thoughts, because I'm here talking with Amy Wilson. She is a fractional chief marketing officer, and she just brings a whole bunch of experience to the conversation when she talks about some of the stories that she's been a part of, brought in by investors, working with first-time founders in industries like FinTech, EdTech, B2B sales. She gave me a bunch of different industries that she works in. It doesn't sound like really there's any industry that she can't work in, but just so we're on the same page, Amy, you are able to take on clients from the United States. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. I work globally.
Okay, great. Yeah, because I think that, when we're thinking about like who's going to watch this episode, there are definitely going to be a lot of people in the United States that are watching this episode. And so I'm glad we got that clarified. So to recap, we talked about these 2 cautionary tales. The first one was kind of this inaction or maybe even a misalignment. You kind of were clear about what the expectations were, the timeline, and needing to have a proper cognitive development, I guess you could say, of a strategy, and maybe an executive or two just not really respecting that. Those projects don't typically go very well. And then we also talked about another instance where you were kind of maybe giving some advice to a business owner about technology. I love the fact they got a quote from Accenture for 300 pounds. I don't know exactly what that converts to in US dollars, but I would imagine it's a lot. And it probably just highlights the point that they just didn't like your advice, even though it was the same, and they felt like they had to pay a humongous amount of money to get it. So that's got to be frustrating, but also a little comical. I did share, a little bit about differentiation, and I think that that's a relevant topic anytime we're talking about marketing. But Amy, I want to let our viewers know that on our next episode, we are going to get right back to our case study we were talking about, which was an EdTech company that was having some issues getting new clients. And as the marketing expert in the conversation here, I'm really looking forward to hearing some solutions from you and some ideas of maybe things they can do differently and better to get more sales. So people, aren't going to want to miss this last episode with Amy Wilson. She is a fractional chief marketing officer from the UK, works globally, 10 plus years experience leading performance marketing initiatives on a global scale. Really looking forward to our next episode, Amy. Talk to you guys soon.